Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ICAS Fall Symposium Veritas. We have a great speaker, General Curtis Mike Scaparrotti. Before we get into it, David Lee, please introduce the General.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor tonight of introducing retired General Curtis Mike Scaparrotti. General Scaparrotti served concurrently as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe and Commander of U.S. European Command from 2016 to 2019. The General was previously assigned as the Commander of United Nations Command, Combined Forces Command, and United States Forces Korea. He has also served as the Director of the Joint Staff, and prior to his tour of the Joint Staff, General Scaparrotti served as Commander of the International Security Assistance Force Joint Command and Deputy Commander of U.S. Forces Afghanistan, the Commanding General of the 1st Corps and Joint Base Lewis McChord, and the Commanding General of the 82nd Airborne Division. Currently, he is a Senior Counselor for the Cohen Group. ICAS is also very proud that General Scaparrotti has been named an ICAS Distinguished Fellow. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Scaparrotti.
Thank you, General. Welcome.
Thank you, Singh Joe.
Good to see you.
And it's good to see you all here, particularly some of the friends that I've worked with over the years. Tonight, I've been asked to cover NATO and the NATO response to the North Korean employment of troops in support of Russia in the Ukraine war. I'm going to expand that a bit as well. I'll just cover the conflict generally first, if you don't mind. And I look forward to questions and discussion afterwards with this august group here. You know, the deployment of North Korean troops to Russia to support their unprovoked and illegal war in Ukraine is, in fact, a significant development with respect to the war itself, but also globally. And you've heard this said by most of the leaders around the globe since this was announced. President Zelensky said this opens a new page in instability in the world. Of course, President Zelensky is concerned about the reinforcement of Russia and the West's support to him continuing and actually being strengthened. The action itself also solidifies the North Korea-Russia Defense Pact that was set or established this past June, and I think a very serious way. The provision of troops to fight for Russia is essentially the ultimate step. And it also invites the thought that Russia would be beholden to reciprocation if North Korea in some future time needs assistance of as well in combat. This is another clear step in violation of the UN Charter, and clearly an expansion of the war itself, increasing the threat to Europe, but also increasing the threat in the Indo-Pacific simultaneously. I'd also add that North Korea is only doing this for a real return on their investment in the short term. Certainly, they expect a real reciprocation from Russia for the provision of troops. Secretary General Letta at NATO stated yesterday, Russia is delivering the latest technology into North Korea in return for North Korea's help with the war against Ukraine. And this is a threat not only to the European part of NATO, but also to the U.S., end quote. I was in Seoul this past week. Steve was there as well with me. And as you can imagine, they're quite focused on this development. They fear that Russian assistance beyond economic and humanitarian aid to North Korea will make a difference, but particularly the difference with North Korea's missile, nuclear, and space programs, and also the development of combat experience by the North Koreans. They also have the opportunity to test their munitions, their systems in combat, and then potentially improve them as well. So essentially, from the Korean perspective, you know, there's a changing calculus on the pen, both capability of the North Koreans eventually, and who may come to their assistance in the future. Now, one thought I immediately had when this was announced was that there will be lessons learned that'll be accrued by North Korea. That only happens when one survives in combat. You've got to survive the experience and come home to then pass those lessons along. And I personally think this is going to be a pretty harsh combat experience, first combat experience since the Korean War for these Korean soldiers. Now, having said that, reflect just a bit on the Korean soldiers. Many of you have good experience as well with their training regimen, etc. But, you know, each of the Korean soldiers are conscripts for 10 years. I mean, that's a long time. It's not a great military, but it's one where they produce tough people, used to hardships, and they're certainly experienced in the weapon system they employ because they've been doing it for about 10 years. On the other hand, they do very little training above battalion level, and it's cursory at best. So when it comes to combined arms employment, more exquisite level of training and employment in combat, I don't believe they will produce that. And I don't believe these soldiers will display that in Ukraine either. Now, it was interesting that it was reported in today or yesterday that Russia curtailed their training. They sent these troops first to Western Russia for a training period. We saw some film of that or photos supposedly on the news. And then they were being sent to Kursk, where some soldiers reportedly, Ukraine and others have reported there are soldiers in Kursk, North Korean soldiers. But it was reported that the training they were supposed to get was cut short and they were moved forward to the front. So what you will have is North Koreans being employed, I don't believe well-trained, and certainly not accustomed to the Russians' operational means. Reported as well that their training was curtailed, and then they received 3 senior Russian officers and 1 interpreter for every 30 troops for employment. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not promising. Three senior officers for every 30 North Korean troops and 1 interpreter is going to present some real problems when they enter combat. And you've probably seen the reports that there's been some intercepts by the Ukrainians that the Russians are not pleased with the North Korean troops at this point, at least those that have met them in Ukraine at this point. The Russians' dismal performance themselves and their inability to perform combined arms operations leads me to believe that these North Korean troops will more likely be used just as Russian troops are, basically as fodder if they're employed in direct combat. Now, what I've read, it appears that they're going to be in Kursk to relieve the pressure on Russia in an area where they've been unable to move substantial forces to counter the incursion into Russia itself. I think North Korea's deployment is another sign of Russia's great difficulties in their conflict. Some have said it's actually signs of desperation on Russia's part or Putin's part. Russia sustained over 1,000 casualties per day in the recent months. Now, that's over 600,000 casualties that's reported. I've seen as high as 800,000. But, you know, that's a high casualty rate for the period of time that they've been at war. Clearly, the Russians are having recruiting problems. They've actually recruited from all of their other services to make them infantry. And, as you know, they've gone to prisons as well. So clearly, Putin does not want this to go to another mobilization, as he did in the past 300,000, and as he experienced the response from the populace, which wasn't pleased with a further mobilization. And he also experienced about 200,000 Russian men of draft age that left the country. North Korean troops are being reported in Kursk, as I said, and I think this too demonstrates that that Putin is hard pressed. He does not want to pull troops off of his main line of effort in the east, and has used primarily less experienced troops, naval forces in some cases, and the FSB in the Kursk region. Now, it's also known that Russia's got a significant shortage of ammo, and reportedly over half the artillery ammunition being fired by Russia is supplied by North Korea. The South Koreans have reported on the number of shipments and trains that have been leaving, and their estimation was that it was in the millions in terms of artillery shells that have been launched or sent to Russia. We also know that they provided ballistic missiles because the Ukrainians have reported them being used by Russia at this point in the war. I would tell you that the advance that Russia has made and is making now is largely based on the help that North Korea and to some extent Iran with their drones is providing, because Russia's advance is slow at this point, but it's made mostly because of heavy use of artillery to reduce the threat of enemy soldiers, and then an advance straight into the teeth of the Ukrainian defense, hence the high casualties. And it's only because of the supply of these additional ammunitions and Russia's willingness to take those high casualties that they've made the progress that they have. Now, overall, I assess this North Korean involvement to be significant in the ways that I've said, but the troop addition itself, that 10,000 troops, I don't judge to be significant. I think it's insignificant at this time, particularly when you look at the fact that they're losing over 1,000 soldiers a day. 10,000 troops from North Korea won't go far. But this could be just the beginning, as I said. What if Putin senses the West response is weak, and therefore he decides to ask Kim Jong-un for more troops? And I believe that could happen. So what have we seen as a response by the West? The U.S. leadership quickly stated that the North Korean troop deployment was, quote, very, very serious. That's our Secretary of Defense, and an escalation in the conflict. President Biden said that it was serious and that the Ukrainians should strike back. Just today, we also announced another $9 billion in support to Ukraine that should come out before the end of the year in order to add sustainment with the transition to a new administration. Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines said that or laid down a marker when she expressed the U.S. government's concern that Russia may drop the long-held non-proliferation norms and the dispatch of troops, the threshold that leads Moscow to break those norms. The UK also called this an escalation and today announced a host of new sanctions on entities and individuals supporting Russia's war effort. And then finally, the SecGen, Ruta, made a doorstep statement, and then also at the European meeting today, said in an op-ed that this was, quote, deeply dangerous moment and a turning point in the war. He also said that NATO would consult with allies, including the Indo-Pacific allies, and monitor closely, not much more. A review of NATO sites resulted in little more than the SecGen's official statement. Now, based on my experience, I believe the NAC's been meeting to discuss an official statement, most likely, and what actions, if any, they should take. And I think, as always, this will take some time. We haven't seen an announcement yet. I would add that under Ukraine and their homepage, here's the quote from NATO. NATO's actions are defensive, designed not to provoke conflict, but to prevent conflict. The alliance has a responsibility to this war does not escalate and spread beyond Ukraine, which would be even more devastating and dangerous. Enforcing a no-fly zone or deploying combat troops to Ukraine would bring NATO forces into a direct conflict with Russia. This would significantly escalate the war and lead to human suffering and destruction for all countries involved, end quote. Now, personally, I believe this is a continuation of the West's timid approach to this conflict. Our fear of escalation and direct confrontation with Russia has consistently encouraged Putin to continue this aggression. I fear that he will read our response to North Korean troops as such, and this may lead to more North Korean troops in the future in Ukraine. Keep in mind that North Korea has 1.1 million men under arms, and then several other million with experience that are in their reserve force. So what do I think we should do? Well, we, and I say we, it's the US and NATO, like-minded allies. First, we've got to set a clear objective with the Ukraine conflict. I happen to believe we have not done that. The quote, as long as it takes, is not an objective. We need to define what we mean by Ukraine must win and Russia must lose. And what does winning mean? We need to demonstrate strength and no longer determine based on Putin's threats. We've seen Ukraine take steps that bypasses or leaps over Putin's red lines, and yet there's still no action, particularly when Ukraine entered Kursk. We should release all restrictions upon Ukraine weapon systems, U.S. weapon systems that they hold, particularly now that North Korea has entered the fray. We need to consider a troop deployment to support Ukraine. A proportional step may be to send trainers, maintenance professionals, etc., to relieve some of that manpower and allow them to focus their veterans on the front and us to help with training. Also to provide a bit of a breather between combat tours for their troops. Now, South Korea, for their part, immediately sent the vice minister to NATO to discuss the impact of this situation. They've said they will send a team to Ukraine to assess the impact for South Korea. A team that stays in Ukraine assesses that impact and feeds it back. And they're not ruling out sending munitions and weapons to Ukraine at this point. That was a point of discussion while I was in Seoul last week. As you can imagine, this also immediately goes into their trust in the United States, the concern about a new administration, and once again, North Korea is developing nuclear and missile capability, and then finally, whether or not South Korea should develop their own nuclear capability. All points of discussion while I was there. Now, finally, the question on all of the allies' minds, what will President Trump do? Last week when I was in Seoul, it was, who do we think will be the president, and what if it is Trump? Well, now we know. Personally, if you look at it, his statements have been vague about Ukraine. Other than his claim to end this war in one day, he's not been as frank as some others. For instance, J.D. Vance and those who might potentially in his administration have been clear about their belief that Ukraine's not a vital interest to the United States, that China's our priority. We need to put our priority there, and that we should leave Ukraine to Europe. And of course, others have heard this comment from Americans as well. I think that without a doubt, the Trump administration needs to take steps early on to assure our allies of our commitments and to assure Ukraine of our continued support for their conflict. I am not going to guess as to what he might really do. One thing I learned, having been a combatant commander, as he was the commander-in-chief, is that he can be unpredictable. And two, often what he says publicly is not what he does actually. As you know, in Europe, we continued to increase forces throughout his time, despite the fact that he was calling to bring forces out of Germany and other places. We never did that. And of course, he was fully aware of what we were doing in Europe and not doing. So I think, in my view, let's be calm. Let's see who's appointed by the administration. From that, we'll have some indications. And as the administration comes in, probably some announcements as they get ready to take over. And then we can make a better judgment as we enter the new administration's time. I personally encourage you to be calm, take prudent steps, but don't prejudge what may or may not happen. And then finally, I think for all of our allies is to engage the Trump administration and put their best foot forward. Since the time that President Trump was in office last, all of our allies, Korea and NATO, have done a great deal to reinforce their defense, to increase their budget, and to pull their share as one looks at the burden sharing equation that President Trump often referred to. So I think they're in much better shape, and they should consider making that one of their first points as they meet with the administration. Those are my thoughts on that tonight, Sang Joe, and I'll leave it open here for what I consider to be a good discussion, I hope, and any questions you may have around the topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scap. That's a great presentation. Before we get into the Q&A session, let me make a small comment. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principal. There's no foreign funds involved in the ICAS activities. Thank you.
Thank you, General, for doing this, sharing your views with us. Now, on what's going on in Ukraine, you had a very comprehensive coverage and your very professional view of what might do. And also you mentioned what the Trump administration #2 may do. And I think Trump said he can end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. But I don't think anybody believes that anyway. And like you said, he said a lot of stuff that was not realistic. And you mentioned some of the things that happened when Trump was in the first term. Now, I want to just focus on an element of what I would call Trump phobia 201, the Trump administration 201, how it's going to impact overall policies of the United States concerning interests of the South Korean security and alliance as well. You mentioned about the cost of sharing, what happened there. Is it better shape now? And now whether he's going to do that again and more. And he has a lot of inaccurate information he cites when he speaks. Like he says, for example, 41,000 instead of 28,000 U.S. troops that are stationed in South Korea today. And exaggerated statistics and inaccuracies often confuse people. So I'd like to hear your views on what Trump administration 201 how it's going to be, could it be different from its first one?
Yeah, well, thank you, Tom. First of all, as I said, I always lead as an optimistic person, but I do want to see who he puts in his administration. That'll give us some indication of where their general views lie and how he'll be advised. Two, I would say that President Trump will listen to those who advise him. I found him to be very open as one of his commanders. I saw him frequently, saw him when I needed to. And so from that viewpoint, that's why I encourage our allies and others to present their case, make the intellectual argument for their ally and one that's paying their fair share. In Korea's case, for instance, you mentioned some inaccurate facts. That's correct. He did have some of his facts wrong, but this is an opportunity to get it right. Now we've occupied a base, for instance, that's the most advanced base that we have overseas for sure, and really is quite good compared to those in the States. 92% of that, $9.2 billion paid for by Korea. That does not include the rail and the rail yard that they put in on top of that. Does not include their burden sharing, which pays, my last estimate when I was there, they paid about between 45 and 55% of our operational costs daily. No other ally does that. They're the 10th largest economy in the world, at least. They're a industrial, defense industrial powerhouse in the sense of their development now. Those are all things that should be corrected. So he understands what this ally brings. And I'm hopeful that that as he comes in, he'll get those updates. So I think that there's an opportunity here to address our allies in a different vein. Also point out that Europe has increased from 8 allies making 2% to now 23, well over $100 billion in excess of what was being done in the past. And also the commitment of troops, substantial commitment in terms of ready troops, and also substantial deployment of troops on the eastern flank by our allies. Those are all things that I would expect him to be made aware of. And so the calculus in the past is a bit different. And I'm optimistic that he'll take that into account. Finally, I think being on the campaign trail and being in the Oval Office are two different places dramatically. And that as he sees and it's described the impact of potentially Russia having success, and he hears from all of our allies about their concerns and the global impact of this, that he'll also consider that in his calculus. I can tell you that in areas where we had discussions, where I was a part of the discussion, Afghanistan, for instance, he will change his mind if the argument is made forcefully and convincingly. So those are the points I would make, and I think that I still say we wait and see.
Thank you, Tom. Do you have a follow-up
Okay, I
question?
have a follow-up question. What it is, I've been talked about the North Korea. What do you think that Donald Trump might do with the North Koreans? North Koreans for themselves might even write another love letter yet. He hasn't done that yet, but they would probably seek recognition of a de facto nuclear state in return for love letters, as they call, as Trump called them. So,
Well, you know,
so will you see how this direction will be regarding North Korean position and how Trump may respond to it?
well, you know, I tend to think if there's going to be a discussion between the Trump administration and North Korea now, it will have to be Trump reaching out. My judgment is that KJU was embarrassed in that last, in what happened with their negotiations. He expected that to be positive. It was not. And that is what is driving his change in doctrine, his change in his, his thoughts on unification, etc. That after that, he took a much harder line. So I would be surprised if we see Kim Jong-un reach out to Trump. I think that even the Trump administration will have difficulty with any discussion with North Korea, which has essentially been cut off with the U.S. since that time. So that's my view. I'd also say this: keep in mind that President Trump's hard stance, for the first time in years, drove Kim Jong-un to come to the table and to open up and meet with Xi Jinping in China. None of that had happened prior to the hard stance that President Trump took when saying that he was prepared to take military action, and then followed that up with a reinforcement of supplies, resources in South Korea. So, as I said, it's kind of unpredictable to say what I think he'll do. He's worked this both ways.
Thank you very much, Scap.
Thank you,
Go
Dr.
ahead.
Thank you, General, for your comments. I don't mean to harp on the same point over and over, but the Wall Street Journal actually did report yesterday President-elect Trump's proposed Ukraine plan, highlights of which include Ukraine giving up NATO aspirations for a 20-year period, the freezing of current front lines, and the establishment of a DMZ between Ukraine and Russia. While it seems extremely unlikely that President Zelensky would agree to those terms, and you did mention that you didn't want to guess what would happen, but given Trump's, how should I say, uncomfortable relationship with Russia and Vladimir Putin, how concerned are you about the direction for the next administration if these reported terms are the kinds of things which are almost certainly extremely unfavorable to Ukraine, if these kinds of things are what's going to be part of President Trump's peace plan?
Yeah. Well, I just put it this way. I'd be very concerned. I've seen those reports in the past. I didn't see the Wall Street Journal article. Those are the same kinds of things that some that might be in his administration have said in the past. I would be very concerned because to believe that Ukraine would not agree with that. That two, that would be dangerous for Europe with that outcome, and certainly dangerous for us globally. For Europe and Ukraine, because I don't think Putin is done. In fact, I think if you froze lines in the conflict, he would do as he's done in the past, use this period to fix his problems, rebuild his military, and then set once again to achieve his goals for a sphere of influence in the East. When this war started, just before it started, he provided a letter to both a peace plan, basically, both NATO and the U.S., which said return to the status of 1994, NATO status, etc., and I won't go into Ukraine, clearly outlining what his maximalist objectives are. And despite all of his difficulties in this war, he has not changed those objectives, in my view. I feel quite certain of that. I've talked to retired Russian generals within the last few months about this, and they are very strong on the fact that they've not changed their objectives, and they believe that they're going to achieve them eventually. So I think that's a danger for Europe, because we will be back into this with a stronger Russia and a more determined one. And then finally, globally, it's a great encouragement to Kim Jong-un, to Iran, to Xi, and China to also continue their aggressive ways, because obviously the United States doesn't have the stomach, nor does the West, to stand up to Russia.
Thank you. David, follow-up question?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, very good. David Maxwell. David.
Thank you, Sanju, and thank you, General Scaparrotti, for your remarks. I'd like to make one comment to follow up, and then I have three short questions. First is, I think you're right about President Trump. We got to wait and see. But I think for those of us who believe in the ROK-US alliance, I think we have to make the case to President Trump that our commitment to Korea is a vital national interest to the United States, that we are not in Korea just to benefit Korea, that our presence there is to prevent war, which is of vital interest to us. And I think that if we can do that, that could serve two purposes. One, if President Trump accepts that, that confirms our alliance. But the other thing that we are always concerned with on the Korean side is their fear of abandonment, their fear of us not using extended deterrence. And the fact that, it's possible we may abandon an ally, but we will never abandon a vital national interest. And so if we can convince President Trump, and if President Trump can take the stand that we are in Korea because of U.S. vital national interests, and yes, because we are supporting our blood ally, but our presence there is to prevent war, and that is a vital interest. So I think that may be a way that we should be discussing this to help make the case to President Trump that it's a vital national interest. My question, sir, is based on your visit to Seoul last week. Number one, do you think that South Korea will provide lethal aid to Ukraine? If so, what type of lethal aid do you think they will provide? And do you think if they do provide it, will they provide a sufficient amount that could potentially, and I don't want to use game changer, but will potentially help Ukraine to defend itself better than they're already able to? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Dave, good to see you. I think you're spot on the vital national interest argument, because it is. I mean, I often made the argument when folks would come to Korea and I was there that even if peace broke out and unification happened tomorrow, right, and everything was just perfect on the pen, we would still want to be there, right? And it's in the Koreans' benefit for us to be there as well. It is a vital national interest. The Pacific is much bigger than people believe it is. and so I think it is a vital national interest, even if peace were to break out. On the extended deterrence note, I agree with you there. The Koreans they want to be reassured. Their official statement, and they, the folks in their government said to me, they've not changed that they remain a party to non-proliferation. They believe in extended deterrence. But they still wring their hands because they do wonder about the credibility of our commitment. And we should make that crystal clear. Now, one thing I will say, I don't recall in my time during the first administration of that being a concern, i.e. that the administration under Trump was considering, not extending deterrence to our allies, etc. In fact, as if you recall, after their nuclear review, they actually recommended and actually began to put in place several systems that close gaps that we have. So I felt like they were very strong on that, and I pointed that out to the Koreans last week as well. How close do I think the Republic of Korea is to providing arms? To be honest with you, I couldn't get a gauge from them one way or the other. But I think the fact that they brought it up as being considered is a strong indicator to me. That's something they wouldn't typically do if they weren't seriously considering that. It will take them explaining to their people the reasoning for that. It's because it's a part of the Constitution as well. So there's some actions they have to take. I believe that could be done. And then secondly, what would they provide? I think they would likely provide both artillery ammunition, because as you know, they can produce and do produce a lot of 155 ammunition, which would be extremely helpful. The Russians right now have about 6 to every 1 of Ukraine's munitions. So the Ukrainians now are really outgunned day to day. And then also, their short-range ballistic missiles would be helpful. Whether or not they would provide them in enough to make a huge difference is hard to say. I can't take a guess on that, but any amount would make a difference for Ukraine at this point. And as you know, these are good systems, unlike the North Koreans, who about 50% of their missiles I've read are failing in flight. I'm fairly certain that the rocks, I know their munitions will be good.
Thank you. David, follow-up question.
No question, just a comment. I do hope, though, that our Korean allies will consider, June 25th, 1950, when the world came to defend freedom in South Korea. And now that Korea is a global pivotal state, that really has the capability to help. But I hope that they will also, remember the moral argument that people came to their aid, that they should come to the aid of another democratic country. So I don't know if that resonates with the Korean people, but I hope it will. So thank you for your comments, sir.
Yeah, Dave, I think it could. That's why I think there's a real possibility for this if they approach it and they go to their people in the way that you've discussed properly. I think they could carry this.
Very good. Daniel, Dan, go ahead.
Hi, General. Thanks so much for taking
Thank you.
time to spend and share your insights. So I wanted to ask more about the potential trade-offs in the support of Ukraine, potentially at the expense of U.S. focus and resources on Asia. And I especially wanted to ask this to you because you've been both commander of Combined Forces Command Korea and SACEUR. So do you see there being trade-offs in supporting Ukraine at the expense of the Indo-Pacific, or do you see them as mutually beneficial? You mentioned some people argue that we should focus on China and let others take care of Ukraine. Others have argued that in some ways this bolsters U.S. credibility, that we would come to the support of our allies and strategic partners. How do you view this?
Yeah, I think our continued support for Ukraine and making sure that Russia is not successful is actually a part of the deterrence for China taking any more aggressive steps within the Pacific. It's that important, first. Secondly, I can tell you from the work that we did and that I've done, not only as a UCOM commander, but prior to that, we take a look at what if there's conflicts in different regions, what if there's two simultaneous conflicts, etc. It's not easy, but we can do this. If you have needs in Indo-Pacific, we looked at what would need to come out of Europe, for instance, or what would be needed from other locations. And we can continue to do our missions around the globe and provide support in one of the other COCOMs. So short of conflict, I'm quite confident that we can do our global missions and continue to support both. I also would say that I don't believe that Xi Jinping is going to do anything soon, unless his thinking is reinforced that we won't act. My take is that they does not believe they're prepared to take on the United States. They're preparing for that, but that's some years out yet. That's my belief with what interactions that I've had. Secondly, for China, their doctrine would more likely lead them to believe that they can undermine Taiwan and continue to be aggressive in hybrid ways and gain influence over time, as opposed to bringing a conflict about in the near term. And so I think we have some time as well. Unless, again, our timidity leads Xi to believe that he can take action and we would not. And he might go earlier.
Any follow-up, Dan?
Thank you. Yes, if I can briefly follow up on the Chinese perspective, do you think China or Xi believes that the U.S. would come to the military aid of Taiwan if China were to intervene or if they were to invade?
Yeah, I believe they do.
Okay.
And they're preparing for a fight with us. And we're really concerned about that because they're building a large military force, a very modern one. I think our advantage presently is that right down to the deck level, we have soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that can fight all domain in ways that China just has not come close to. But give them time, and they will increasingly be better and more of a threat to us.
Thank you. Sir, go
Thank you.
ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Good evening, General. You did mention about 600,000 to 800,000 casualty rate falling on Russian, but my information is the opposite. Those figure belongs to Ukraine, and some people say that Ukraine will collapse before Christmas, and Zelensky will depart before Christmas, and so that's my first question. The second question is, of the 10,000 North Korean soldiers that were deployed in Russia, how many reached the Kursk region? My information is that they routinely conduct training with Russia in the east part of the Russia near the North Korea, and that they have been doing that for decades. And this treaty, the pact that signed in June this year, was simply a pact. But then all of a sudden deployment is heard in November. So on what basis do you have this information that there's a casualty of Russians, 600,000 at least, and there's 1,000 a day casualty on the part of Russia?
Yeah, so those numbers that I'm picking, the 100 or 1,000 to 1,500 a day, those have been reported by intelligence folks from the U.S., or at least our government. I've seen government leaders refer to that. I've heard very similar numbers in Europe. I've been in Europe several times this year, Poland twice in the last 2 months. And those figures are consistent with what I've heard from other leaders in the West. The casualties are very high for Russia, particularly in September. September is claimed to have been their worst month since the war started, with figures higher than 1,000 a day. I have confidence in that, just given the number of officials from different governments, including the U.S., that have said that's a routine number. I don't know what Ukraine's losses are. I expect that they're fairly heavy as well, as you suggested, but Ukraine doesn't supply those, nor have I had anybody tell me what they think they are in terms of real numbers. I've not heard they'll run out by December. I know that there's concerns from those who know a little more intimately how they're doing, that manpower is a real issue. Now, one thing I would say is that keep in mind that they're only bringing in those who are above the age of 25. When they get into dire straits, they're going to dip below that, and they have not done that yet. And that means there's a reservoir out there yet that they have made a decision not to tap inside of Ukraine. The training with Russia is interesting because I looked, as you can imagine, as the commander for 3 years. I watched North Korean training very closely, and the training with Russia was minimal at best during that time. And the training that is done in North Korea, again, as an individual, you may say that they're a formidable soldier, perhaps, but with any fighting capability at a unit level, particularly above battalion, I can tell you with great confidence that it's non-existent, or it's non-existent in any means that you have to employ forces in a modern battlefield. So I'm not. I'm confident of my thoughts on the North Korean force training and structure. Kim Jong-un has made a difference in that he actually set standards and then checked training and held people to it. When he took over, you may recall that he visited the front units, and they had a norm of doing a pop inspection with the unit knowing it was coming and what it was going to be. He stopped doing that. And when he did, the first regional commander that failed one, he sent him to a range as a private. and another one he killed to set the example that, there will be more POP training inspections. And if you don't do well, it will not be good for the generals. So that has improved their training. And I would say, but they have never been very rigorous at battalion or above. So hopefully it answers your question. If you've got the source, for your Ukrainian, I'd be interested in seeing that.
Very good. Thank you. Nobuo Tanaka from Tokyo. If not, Larry Linux.
Yes,
Go ahead.
General, a couple of questions. First of all, on the Trump statement on Ukraine that was referred to earlier, I have not seen that, but I have seen the proposal from Vice President-elect J.D. Vance that there should be negotiated a ceasefire and a ceasefire line, but that Ukraine should pledge neutrality. And I take that to mean no membership in NATO or no alliances with the United States or any other Western messages. Now, I believe that a negotiated ceasefire and a DMZ created from that ought to entail either membership in NATO for Ukraine or some specific defense agreements between the US and Ukraine or some of the other European NATO countries and Ukraine. I think to counter this Trump-Vance proposal, I think a couple of historic things should be put before them. Number one, the Munich Agreement turned over territory in Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany, but because of that, but in that agreement, or as in the outcome of that agreement, neither Great Britain or France gave any specific security guarantees to what remained of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
6 months later, the Germans marched in and took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. The other alternative is the Korean armistice. Now, we know, all of us, that South Korea did not sign the armistice agreement and never has up to this day. South Korea, the government in Seoul, had several reasons for doing this. They thought it would hamper prospects for unification. They were also concerned that the armistice line that was being negotiated was only 25 miles north of Seoul, rather than 25 miles south of Pyongyang, which is the case today. Now, President Eisenhower, in his wisdom, recognized these South Korean concerns, and he acted to order the State Department to prepare a mutual defense treaty between the US and South Korea, which he then offered to South Korea a few months after the armistice agreement was signed. And South Korea, of course, entered into that agreement with a lot of satisfaction. And that agreement remains today as the bedrock for the U.S. defense commitment. So you have those two contrasting historical scenarios about what happens when a country is forced to make territorial concessions, but on the one hand, what happens to it when it receives in turn no defense guarantees from any of the other countries, versus what happens when a country that is in the same situation does receive a big defense guarantee from a major supporter. So that contrast ought to be thrown and presented to President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, seems to me. These historical analogies, I think, are very fit to this negotiation situation right now. Now, my question in terms, going back to what can South Korea do directly for Ukraine if it chooses to go ahead? And I understand and have seen the reports that South Korean officials have said that they are considering doing direct military support for Ukraine. I want to ask you about one major element: artillery shells. The South Korean National Intelligence Service has stated that in the last 2 years, North Korea has provided Russia with 8 million artillery shells.
Yeah.
This is a big reason for the big imbalance in Russia's favor that it has in artillery capabilities along those front lines in the eastern Ukraine. I have seen quotes from Ukrainian commanders in the east that for every 10 rounds of artillery shells the Russians hit us with, we can only fire 1 in return because of our limited supplies. So can or could South Korea begin to supply directly Ukraine with tens of thousands or hopefully hundreds of thousands of artillery shells if they make a decision to start to direct assistance to Ukraine?
Yeah, Larry. Thanks for your comments. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, I think the security guarantee is the key, right? And I've seen Vance's comments as well along the lines that you talked about. And I think the two historic examples you use would provide a good contrast, but that's the kind of discussion that has to take place. And I'm not certain that that's happened at this point. As I said before, I don't agree with an agreement otherwise or a negotiation that leads to anything other than a security guarantee, because I think we just invite Putin to bide his time and start all over again. In terms of the artillery shells, South Korea's got quite a capability to produce artillery shells, and they have quite a good stockpile as well, from my experience. So I think it's one way that they can actually make a very significant difference. As I said before, I think it's important because it's actually the Russians' ability to overmatch them in artillery and indirect fire that's allowing them to make their advance, even though it's quite slow and quite brutal. It is actually what's allowing them to make that advance. Their troops are so poorly trained that without that kind of artillery fire in advance of them, they wouldn't even be making the advances they're making today tactically. I too have read of the high numbers that North Korea provided. That I didn't give you the number, but I've read numbers that high, and most of what I've read says that they're supplying well over 50% of what Russia's firing today. So wholeheartedly agree with you.
Thank you. Seung-jae from Seoul.
Okay, well, thank you very much talking about the artillery, shells. But I just want to remind you, when Korea have a war, the U.S. general will be conducting the Korea War. So Trump administration, what they like, so when Korea have a war, do they expect Korea have a lot of sales so U.S. not worry about dealing with North Korea, or Korea without shells to fighting with North Korea?
Seung-jae, I'll probably have to ask you again in the second part. Let me take the first part that I understood. I would just remind everybody remind you that although it's a U.S. general, he is the CFC, the Combined Forces Command Commander. And in that role, he reports to not only the U.S. President and the U.S. Secretary of Defense, he reports to the Korean Minister of Defense and the President in that strategic body. And so Korea is not conducted as solely a U.S. conflict. It's conducted as an alliance, with alliance decisions being taken by both sides. So I think that's the first thing. And then secondly, with respect, now I think what you were asking was, what about, would we expect South Korea to ensure that they can supply the proper munitions? The answer is yes. When you just saw that last week they had the SCM, Strategic Consulting Meeting. The week, I think before that or days before that, they had the MCM. It's a week prior, I think. Usually they're right together. The MCM is the military consultation meeting. And in that meeting, routinely, they go through the status of resources and capabilities. And over the years, both U.S. and ROC have had capabilities that weren't at the standard we all wanted them to be at for the warfighter. So those are tracked every time, every quarter that the MCM, the chairman and the U.S. CFC commander meets, or the USFK commanders meet, and every time they have an MCM. So we watch that carefully, and there's expectations for both sides, because there are areas that the United States provides niche capabilities, and there's others like where we would expect Korea to provide ample ammunition, etc. Does that answer your question?
Well, actually, the first question also related with the second question, because I understand that Mr. Trump want to try evaluate the alliance, so who is a good alliance and better alliance. I'm pretty sure Korea want to be a good alliance with America. And so I'm pretty sure if U.S. thought Korea supposed to be given to the artillery shells to the Ukraine, if the president said that, I'm sure Korea will be followed. But Korea don't want to tell the U.S. When North Korea attack, we sell the shell because of we want to earn the money. Also, another thing is the price of artillery shells. Before the Ukraine war, artillery shells in Korea, 155, supposed to be just like $300. But right now, it's one artillery shell is $3,000. But we also have to think about when we having a war in Korea, probably artillery shells price maybe goes up to $6,000 or $10,000. Who knows? But Korea don't want that kind of situation. So as long as the U.S. conducting with Korea, talking right as you mentioned, if both countries agree, I'm sure Korea have no problem to give to the artillery shells to the, Ukraine. But without the U.S.'s agreement, maybe very difficult to give to the artillery shells to the Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the assurance, right? The assurance of the United States commitment to the Republic of Korea.
Yeah.
I'm sure that would be a part of this, and it would be, because in the alliance we make these kind of decisions with consultation on both sides.
Yeah, but so it's because so please think about you've been to last week in Korea, and then also Korea want to be a good alliance, not just alliance. Also, Korea is a totally different position than Ukraine. So when U.S. agree, I'm pretty sure Korea is ready to give to the artillery shells to, Ukraine, but not business, way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sanjay. David Maxwell,
Yes.
do you have follow-up question or follow-on question?
Yes, just what Sanjay was saying, South Korea has already been providing 155 artillery to the U.S. to
That's right.
backfill.
Indirectly.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's not a leap to go that far, and with South Korea as a global pivotal state and being the 6th largest defense now industry in the world, I mean, they've got tremendous capabilities, and I think a lot more than just 155 artillery shells. The tanks they're selling to Poland and Ukraine, the K9 howitzers. I think there's a lot more that they might be able to do than just the artillery shells and ballistic missiles. I think if they really committed to providing really advanced systems to Ukraine, I think it could make a difference. But I do think that 155 is the most important, and so I think we'll see them do that. I hope we'll see them do that.
Yeah, David, I was in Korea last week. I had the opportunity to go down to Hyundai Rotem and walk through the production line of the K9, and then also over to aerospace, over to Hanwha Aerospace, and walk through the K2 line. And it's really impressive. And they've ramped up that to meet the commitments in Poland in particular. So they absolutely have a great defense capability.
There's a great photo of you in Korea Times, and when you were at Hanwha, all the former U.S. commanders, all of you there. So
I'm not surprised.
Thank you. Thank you. Tom, do you have follow-on question?
Oh, not really.
Okay. Larry, do you have follow-on question?
Let me just make a comment about the South Korean capabilities. And somebody brought up the example of Poland. I believe the agreement for South Korean sale of weapons to Poland in 2022 was about $1 billion as the total. And this included several hundred artillery pieces, tanks, and fighter aircraft to Poland. And I remember reading when 3 months after the agreement was signed, the first South Korean ship docked in Poland's main port with the first big shipment of this weaponry. On the dock to welcome the ship were Poland's prime minister and its defense minister. They were just overjoyed about this agreement and thought it was just huge for Poland's defense. Poland, as I think you know, General, is now spending close to 5% of its GDP on defense now.
Yeah. Which
is way above the NATO minimum standard of 2%.
Above the United States.
And a lot of that has to do with purchasing this huge quantity of weapons from South Korea.
Yeah, and in fact, Larry, it's above the United States percentage of GDP as well.
Thank you, Larry. Chung-Soo, go ahead.
Just to switch the topic a little bit, what do you think about the Israel's attack on Iran last week or so? And I heard the report saying, or analysis saying, that they had 3 phases. They went in first phase, they discover unknown defense system that was so well operating. They came back and they never entered Iranian airspace, but they shot the missile from the Iraq sky, and Israel withdrew, abandoned second and third phase. Does that show the sophistication of Iranian defense system that was supported by Russia? So by inference, do you assess that of Russian sophistication defense system?
No, actually, I'd like to see where you read that. My understanding was that was 3 phases. The phases had to do with what conditions needed to be set in the first and second phase to ensure that the third phase would be successful, and that was the strike on critical infrastructure. And in fact, the first phase had to do with missile defense systems. that were a threat to them, to include those outside the country, in Iraq, for instance, that would be a threat to their aircraft. They never planned to enter Iran to conduct this strike. It would be done from outside. And then lastly, that the Israelis claim to have hit all the targets they intended to hit. And that it, to me, my takeaway was it's proven once again that even the best Russian systems we can defeat. We demonstrated this ourselves. The Israelis have demonstrated they're good systems, but we have a capability of defeating those systems when we want to go downtown. And the Israelis did it. Now, the last thing I've read from a couple of sources is that they also took out some of Iran's air defense systems around some of their key sites that they chose not to bomb, which was a signal to Iran that if we want to come after some of your more exquisite nuclear missile sites, we now do it. And I tend to believe that report, and I think that was something that the Israelis, in the way they typically operate, would be likely to do. So thank you. That's what my takeaway was from what I read.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I have a question which somebody wrote me asking the general, what is your opinion on the South Korea's nuclear option? If not now, when, or down the road?
Yeah. So my opinion is, and I've stated this in Korea, that South Korea, if they chose to take a nuclear option themselves, would actually be in greater danger than they are today under extended deterrence. Keep in mind, I've also been an alliance leader where we had tactical nuclear systems, and we utilized not only the support of extended deterrence, but we had 2 other nations in Europe that could provide nuclear weapon systems. In the case on the peninsula, I don't think there's any advantage to having stationed in Korea a nuclear system, a nuclear weapon system, to include tactical ones. What people often think about is they think, well, a nuclear weapon, a bomb or whatever, you just got to develop the system. When South Korea does the analysis of the cost of developing that system, the cost then of training, securing, operating, and maintaining safety of those systems that are going to be difficult to hide. It is, it's quite a resource intensive effort, and one that I'm certain the same amount of funds, a great deal of defense funds, in fact, could be used in a better way by South Korea. Our extended deterrence works on a triad. It provides an absolute capability that I know is true and tested, and keeps our adversaries guessing as to where it's going to be when. They can't be sure of that. I think that's a much better assurance or security for the South Koreans than developing their own tactical system.
Well, thank you very much, General Scap. Now time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give the General a big round of applause. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Senju. I appreciate
Thank you. Thank
everybody
you. This is great. And
hearing.
we'll get back to you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The meeting is adjourned.